Politics in the 21st century has been undergoing a massive transformation. The Cosmopolitan Shipwrecks asks, is politics an abstract dream, stripped from emotions? And how technology such as artificial intelligence, social media, and virtual reality is altering our worldviews, with which the public sphere is being defined. Our guest is Nina Power, a philosopher and a cultural critic. Nina has written various articles and worked as both co-editor and co-translator of Alain Badiou's On Beckett, also the author of the 2009 volume One-Dimensional Woman. Greetings and welcome to a new episode of the Cosmopolitan Shipwrecks. So I would like to welcome Nina Power and thank you for joining us.
No worries.
Nina, very welcome. Great to have you. So, what caught our attention at first is that you like to call yourself a Luddite often in relation to technology. Now, for our viewers who are not familiar with the term, Luddite comes from originally came from a secret society of British textile workers who were opposed to mechanization of the workforce and machinery. So this philosophical, distrust of technology that you're advocating to us here on YouTube or via StreamYard, this does resonate with some of us, those of us who are lousy at manipulating apps, not very good at getting accustomed to apps, and we live in this society where people of all ages are expected to use apps. There's facial recognition technology and the ethical problems. This initially comes to mind, and I'm wondering if can you expound to us more on your distrust of technology or how you justify this Luddite position here in the 21st century?
Sure. I think, to be kind of a bit more precise, the Luddite position is not sort of necessarily completely anti-technology. It's rather this situation when tools start to dominate workers. And the same would go for a thinker like Ivan Illich, who I'm very influenced by and I find very moving and meaningful. And, he wrote this book called Tools for Conviviality, in which he precisely looks at the role of technology and the way that people can become tools of the tool, and how instead we should think about tool use in the name of being together, living together, that tools should not be come to dominate us. And obviously, since Illich's writing, since the Luddites, we now live in a completely technologized age. Obviously the lockdown has made it much clearer to people in richer countries the dominance of the internet and the role of the computer in our lives, and the way in which that's come to stand in for all of our meaningful interpersonal connections, and how this is kind of manifested in terms of atomization, increased loneliness, absolute distance from one another. The sort of severing of social bonds makes it harder for people to negotiate, to work out how best to live together, to be together, how to talk to one another. So there's a kind of clear way in which technology is destructive of our well-being in multiple ways.
For our viewers, so Ivan Illich, I associate him with pedagogy. He was an educator, he was a priest, who lived in, I believe, in what is called Spanish Harlem, in the Puerto Rican neighborhoods, impoverished neighborhoods, and he had certain alternative views on education, which were quite revolutionary for the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So his most famous idea is this idea of deschooling, in this idea that basically schooling and the institution of education doesn't actually teach any skills. And he proposed instead this idea of skills exchange, and talks about learning networks and a kind of totally deinstitutionalized understanding of pedagogy, which would actually be kind of real. It would be a real world form of education, as opposed to training in kind of ideology, in training in how to be in an institution or in a structure, which, again, he felt was kind of detrimental to the human spirit. And that's been an interesting question too. What's happening to education, whether the higher education institutions are now kind of crumbling in certain ways. We might see the collapse of certain of these institutions in the next few years, no doubt. And their replacement, for better or worse, with online technology, and it's interesting to ask what Illich would have made of that, given his suspicion of technology.
Zoom, classroom, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And everything that's lost in the absence of that kind of interaction.
So we are faced with this challenge now of technological dominance, and the left. How is the left prepared to face this without, for example, being falsely interpreted as reactionary? I was the other day looking on, for example, on Google or on DuckDuckGo to see if there are any movements out there that are critical of facial recognition technology seeking to abolish it. And the result that I got was mostly a critique claiming that facial recognition technology is racist, that there's an implicit bias, and some programmers or someone close to Jeff Bezos might apologize and see how to fix the programming. But what was missing was a critique of what is altogether wrong or inhuman with this kind of facial recognition technology. Like, how is the left going to, or how is some kind of organization or movement with good intentions, how are we going to apprehend this challenge? How are we going to face it?
Yeah, I think the left needs to be defending a notion of freedom with great urgency, because I think this is a concept, whether we're talking about individual liberty or freedom of a population, that is an argument that's being won by the right currently. And I think the left, if it continues to kind of sign up to these various forms of kind of observation and surveillance, which it didn't used to do. The left used to be very, very suspicious of these incursions into people's freedom of expression, also freedom of association. The right to protest is a very, very important right. So I think the left strongly needs to be defending a notion of freedom against this technology, because we can talk about the introduction of social credit systems. They already exist to some extent. We are looking at a situation in which people's lives will be tied to their social credit score, and people will be banned from, having access to particular resources. So
credit, the system that is used in China, actually.
Yeah. So it looks increasingly likely that either if UBI is kind of introduced, that it will be tied to some kind of social credit system. It already operates in relation to particular apps like Uber, for example. And, you can imagine a situation in which people's ranking, as it were, will determine their access to resources. And I think this sort of technologization of every aspect of our life should be resisted very strongly. But in order for people to do that, we need to have an image of freedom that it goes far beyond what we're being kind of told freedom is. And this becomes very complicated in the situation of the pandemic, when you have this situation of biosecurity and, these things are being introduced in the name of public safety. Right. But there are other notions of the public, like the free public, the protesting public, the social world, that go far beyond the question of this, surveilled public. So I think we need to talk very seriously on the left about freedom and what we mean by it.
And kind of picking up on the point of freedom, then this means also expression of emotions. And I remember you gave a talk last year and the Symposium of Performing Society in Berlin, where you kind of talked about how there's a split between politics and emotions, and like also kind of coupled with intense individualism and consumerism. Then the public sphere is kind of empty and has a void, and like
would you think that also the introduction of new technologies like AI and all these automated decision making, how will it affect the public sphere and our relationship between each other?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, and there are sort of several things going on in what you're asking, and one of which is to do with the future of work and the future of labour. If the more we move towards an automated world. The first one, though, maybe I want to talk about is the question of emotion and politics. And emotions are a very volatile thing to base politics upon. Clearly, it's when people have disagreements, and politics is basically nothing other than a series of disagreements that we hopefully come together to negotiate to ensure the best possible life for as many people as possible. And everybody should be involved in politics. In that sense, everybody is involved in politics. But we also see a kind of often a use of emotion in politics, the idea that somebody feels a certain way, therefore they should have a particular thing. And one way of looking at the relationship between emotion and thought is to, in a Spinozist way, for example, to see them as like two ways of looking at the same thing. So not to say that emotion is irrational and thought is rational, not to make those kind of distinct separations, but to begin from a starting point, for example, that in a sense everybody suffers. Everybody has problems, everybody has desires, everybody has needs. Sometimes those things are not being met. How do we best ensure that all of those things are met to the extent that they can be, if you like? And that's a very, very complicated question. So when politics sort of talks or incorporates emotion, I don't think it can be purely based on emotion in a certain way. There has to be a kind of recognition of a language that we can talk in together, even when we're discussing quite painful things. And it's never to deny the reality of people's emotion, but rather to say, well, how best are we going to then sort of socially work together in order to make things as good as possible, if not perfect, because in a way politics will never make things perfect, I think. So, but yeah,
isn't the attempt to resolve this duality, or now the fashionable word to use is binary, isn't it this something of like the North Atlantic culture and its tradition? Because looking from Latin America, like here an intellectual can express emotion without seeming unintellectual, whereas it seems like something relatively new in the context of like the Anglo-Saxon culture and academic society. They've just discovered that one can express oneself emotionally in the intellectual context, but then it seems as if they go to the other extreme, which is they propagate something very anti-intellectual and based purely on feelings.
Yeah, and again, I think there's a kind of complexity here because, on the right, you have this slogan, I guess, facts don't care about your feelings, right? This idea that there's a kind of way of looking at the world rationally and, scientifically, and that, you might think that things are unfair for various reasons, but it doesn't matter ultimately. Your feelings are irrelevant. And, that's far too harsh a position, right? It doesn't take into consideration also the way in which facts are sometimes mobilized in an emotional way, for example, and they often are. In fact, we're surrounded by statistics and polls and models, and that I think, one thing I think that's quite important, and maybe this is also kind of Ivan Illich or R.D. Laing type point, is the dimension of the necessity for a kind of collective psychoanalytic approach, right? So that we, in order to understand how we work as a group, even within two people on our own, that how we might work at the larger levels, we need to understand that there are kind of multiple motives for why people say and do things, that everybody is kind of amenable to having a kind of conversation about what's really going on with them. And I'm not really sure how you would institute a kind of widespread, generalized, collective psychoanalysis for everyone. But I do think there is something to this. I don't think politics should be psychoanalysis, right? Nor do I think it should be the place for pure emotion. I think there has to be a kind of detachment and separation, but at the same time a recognition of emotion. And I think one of the issues is that we're all very emotionally manipulable, and lots of times online, for example, we might get kind of, we might get very strong feelings from things that people are saying, but they might not be accurate. This is part of the problem, right? It's much harder when you're face to face with somebody. If they're upset with you, or if you're upset with them, you can have a conversation and you can understand the reality and the depth of the feeling and what it means, and whether there's misunderstanding, whether there can be resolution or whether there can't be. But online, we've created this kind of emotional, chaotic nightmare in which people are kind of constantly, tripped into feeling one thing or another, which can be very, very dangerous. And I think, the manipulation of emotion is when politics, pure emotion is when politics goes very badly wrong,
Well, Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist from Martinique turned revolutionary, he psychoanalyzed the entirety of Algeria and the entirety of the colonized world in the psychoanalysis, exploring the purpose of all this irrationality that happens in such an uprising. I think, speaking of which, Mohammed has a question.
So the late Zygmunt Bauman, in his book Liquid Modernity, kind of talks how there's a split between politics and power. The politics is like the decision of what should be done or what can be done, and where power is like the tools of doing what is need to be done. And also kind of coupled with kind of the consumerism and kind of creating desire for consumers' goods, but also I kind of thought of the term present politics, where people are always kind of pushed to think about the future, not just the temporal, but also the spatial, move to that place and then you'll be happy, or just wait for a couple of years and then you'll be happy. So kind of there's a split between the mind and the body. The body is in the present. There's all these kind of environmental signals coming in, but the mind is somewhere else. And this gives a sense of powerlessness and hopelessness and kind of isolation. So it goes also in the direction that you alluded to before, that how we have to reinstitutionalize this collective within this sphere. So I would like to get your opinion on how to reconcile this mind-body split. Is it possible in this age?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think someone like Bifo talks about this in a very interesting way when he talks about the kind of electrocution, like everybody's sort of in the time of the internet, which is kind of endless, like it's 24/7, right? It doesn't pay attention to the necessity for sleep or these kind of human aspects, it's just kind of endless. And I agree that we're kind of forced into the future in a certain way, in an unhappy way. And anxiety is one mode of being, having a worried relation to the future that a lot of people are in, this kind of constant worry, whether it's about money or, about what's going to happen, about environmental disaster, about political problems, so on. So, yeah, I think, at the same time, we have a kind of consumerist culture, as you say, which encourages perhaps the splitting of mind and body as well, and the kind of emphasis on particular kinds of bodies at the same time as it's selling things that are very unhealthy for you. So, in order to sort of wend your own way through this very unhealthy world that is kind of constantly generating new desires for you, new habits, bad habits, is very hard. And I think a lot of people suffer from, addiction. I myself have done, many people have done in the past. It's, or still do. I think lockdown has been very bad for people in this regard. So, I mean, one thing, would be to kind of reconfigure our conception of time and think about our relation, like I was saying, about freedom and the present. What would it mean to kind of live in the present, be able to live in the present, even in the face of these kind of understandable worries, and to live collectively in the present, because it's in the present that our mind and body are the most together, even if we're kind of feeling unhappy. And I think Western philosophy, if you read Heidegger and so on, he says that we live futurally, that we always live in the mode of looking forward. But there are kind of definite challenges to this. If you read Hannah Arendt and her emphasis on natality and birth rather than on being towards death. You know, why are we always looking towards the end? Why not kind of, in a way, backwards, or to accept our kind of existence in the meantime? And I think, yeah, that one thing the left, you know, needs to think about more, I suppose, is this kind of what it can do to help people reconnect the mind and the body. You know, is it capable as a political project of emphasizing, you know, a kind of healing, if you like, a healing that isn't kind of is readily amenable to a kind of capitalist co-optation? You know, it's the idea of a kind of well-being or health cult, but rather a sort of more natural relationship.
Yeah, that is quite interesting. I have a follow-up question, because when you talk about death and how the future, but also the past, also like there's always this rhetoric of the end of the day, like in the extreme right religious groups, they talk about the end of the day, the apocalypse, and then you have all these militarization everywhere. At the same time, you have, with the climate crisis, people are also saying, we have to do this right now, otherwise we're gonna die or whatever. Like all these bad things that are gonna happen. So it keeps feeding the sense of hopelessness and weakness and powerlessness, also kind of coupled with the isolation and individualism. So how like it also has a negative effect, this doomsday rhetoric somehow. Like, should we also change it in a sense?
It's a really interesting question, and I think you're right that there is a kind of an analogy or compatibility between kind of religious end of the world type doctrine, sort of millenarianism, and the climate kind of crisis. You know, the climate idea, the kind of Extinction Rebellion point, for example, that it's kind of almost already too late, and you know everything's kind of apocalyptic. I suppose one thing, going back to the emotion question, the mood question, would be, well, what's the best emotion or mood for doing politics? Is it rampant fear and anxiety and anguish and suffering? Probably not. Or guilt, for that matter. Guilt is not, you know, particularly useful political emotion, it seems to me. And a lot of politics now is around guilt. And so at the same time, I think one can rationally recognize that there are problems, you know, like environmental crisis, and at the same time, and also have emotions about it. But to actually be pragmatic, to think politically, might be to kind of put some of those things, the emotions, to one side and think, what can I do, or what can we do? You know, when we're battling kind of major corporations who are doing serious environmental damage, it looks like one person can't do very much in a way, right? So there has to be a kind of understanding of what one is capable of. Otherwise, you end up just throwing yourself at the wall endlessly, you know, and kind of doing more damage to yourself because you want to solve the problems, but it can't be done just in isolation.
Of course, and many of these campaigns seem fear-driven or guilt-driven, asking the powers that be to intervene and to do something. Our third question relates to art, because you are also an art critic publishing in Art Review. You are concerned with the art world and the current situation. Now, surveying the art world has given the impression that many artists, contemporary artists, successful ones who were apolitical about 15 years ago, suddenly discovered that militancy is art, and that social science academics are natural-born curators. Many people think of philosophers as Plato's guardians who chase the seditious poets out of the Republic of the philosopher kings. You have taken much interest in contemporary art. So how do you defend aesthetics today? How do you today defend art when art is expected and under pressure to be political, to be useful or political in a very specific sense, sometimes a very specific ideological sense? How do you, as a leftist, defend art while also defending yourself against the accusation that you are advocating some bourgeois, embrace of art for art's sake and so on?
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on here. I mean, I think, my position, I suppose, on freedom of expression and art as kind of holding up perhaps a critical light to what's going on probably comes from the late 90s in a certain way, and a particular kind of leftist position which I maintain, although it's kind of hard to hold on to because things have moved so far, but would be that the left is the position that defends freedom of expression and subversion and art as a kind of exploration, let's say, of the dark things that happen. Art is the place in which these kind of things can be discussed and explored, and a mirror held up to the world. And I think what we've seen is the kind of co-optation of a certain kind of seemingly political rhetoric, or political art making, that in a sense is kind of increasingly compatible with the art market, with the kind of ideology of institutions. And it's a particular kind of ideology, and it's sort of, art is a very, very flimsy and unstable world. The art world is very, very it's often at a loose end, like it doesn't really know what it's doing. So it's very open to faddishness and to different fashions. And we've seen a particularly dominant kind of fashion come in the last 10-15 years, but at the same time this kind of sort of, let's say, art trying to be moral covers over a lot of what institutions are actually doing, the various investments that they're involved in, the actual structure of the art world and the world in general. So it can operate as a kind of cover story. So I think that art does have a role in being kind of political and subversive and making points that can only be made in particular registers, whether we're talking about satire or irony or mockery or overconformism. Bands like Lieback are very important in this, and in that sense, I mean, art as such should be kind of defended against a kind of moralism that seeks to sort of inhibit it, because then art is no longer going to be able to function as a critical force in society, let alone as a kind of form of expression and a modality of being that many people partake in, whether they play music or art, whether they're amateurs or not. So I think this inhibiting of expression, and a very narrow image of what political art is, that's being encouraged by multiple institutions, is very, very cynical. And I don't think it relates to how most people understand their own art or how they feel about art. And it's become very...
I've noticed a literalist trend in several countries, where I see, even in music, there's a band playing and the guy's talking about economics, subsidies, gender, something else, institutional, and there is no longer a symbolism in the lyrics. And I've even heard this in the Caribbean, even some guy talking about statistics in the middle of a song, and I'm thinking, what's going on here? This literalism, and I wonder if are we free today to say no to a fashion? Like in the past, there was subcultures, there was underground, which is like a hiding place to get away from the mainstream. Do you find these pockets of the underground still exist, or have they been completely penetrated or whatever?
Yeah, I think they're much less in existence than they used to be, and I think this is partly to do with the way in which platforms are being used. So like the domination of like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and so on, and it makes kind of particular, as well as this dominant kind of very moralistic image of politics, which might not even be politics at all actually, but rather some kind of deep anthropological other thing, quasi-religion or something like this, in which there is very little nuance and there's distaste for anything that creates discomfort. Whereas a lot of the great works of art, particularly when they first appeared, created great scandal and great discomfort, whether we're talking about Stravinsky's Rite of Spring or Pasolini's Sallow. But these are things that tell us a great deal about the culture and the time and about humanity. And so that kind of urge to censor, which used to be associated with the right, has now kind of moved over to, the so-called left in some instances. And this is a big problem. I mean, again, it goes back to the freedom point. And yeah,
there's also an idea that the left is somehow consolidated with like arts councils or various established institutions at the very top level who identify as the left, which is, I think, unprecedented. But that's maybe a topic for later exploration, as I see, unless I see Mohammed has a question for you.
Yeah, thanks. Just a follow-up question on the point of freedom. We'll go back to the tension between the individual and the collective. The tension, the individual is always reflected by the collective and vice versa. So the question: is there any kind of unlimited desire or unlimited freedom? So there is always this conversation, either conscious or unconscious, that happens, so that we kind of find a form of how we want to live as a collective. So where is the boundaries, or is it just always in a kind of evolution that it's always kind of expanding the freedom of the individual? Because I just have that kind of my observation that in Western Europe or the US, there is kind of, after the Industrial Revolution, there was a very strong sense of individualism that's reflected now. But since 2008, there's again trying to after the economic crisis, that there's a need to find the public sphere again and the relation between the individual and the collective. Whereas if I take, for instance, the Middle East, there was always a strong emphasis on the collective. Whereas after 2011, where it was always there that the individual was trying to find his or her place, but after 2011 was kind of clearer. So as if the two poles are kind of converging together into a certain place where the individual is there, but also the collective in a sense. Do you see such a direction happening, or such observation?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that comes out of the Marxist tradition, particularly around the German ideology, I suppose, is Marx's idea that we don't yet even really know what it means to be an individual. You know, that the kind of image of individuality that's sort of sold to us, and that, you know, we partake in as kind of, you know, members of capitalist societies in a way, is completely limited. You know, that actually we have all these polyvalent skills and talents, but we're kind of funneled into particular desires and particular roles. So we don't actually fully get to express ourselves. So the image of the individual that we're presented with in modernity, let's say, is a very one-sided or one-dimensional image in the first place. Even those ideologies that seek to defend the individual above the collective, let's say. And Marx will talk instead about the social individual. And of course, we are nothing and nobody without recognition, without vulnerability, without our connections. You know, there is no kind of unlimited freedom. There's no pure freedom, in the sense that we are always in context. We are always, you know, limited by multiple things. So I suppose the idea of freedom here is, and in relation to the individual and the collective, is one of a kind of constant negotiation, if you like, which perhaps sounds quite liberal in a certain way. But I think this idea that there's always going to be disagreement, that in a way the social sphere is sort of founded on, you know, different positions, different interests, different desires, and that's a kind of reality of the social in a certain way. But that doesn't mean that we can't work together to make things better for people, you know, to the extent that we can make things better for everybody. So the social and the individual, in that sense, you know, even where they're both kind of limited by our circumstances, you know, we don't yet know what the collective is either, right? It's like, you know, nevertheless, somewhere in between the kind of individual and the social, there is this point of possibility for discussion. And people have these discussions all the time, you know, whether we're talking with our neighbors or with people we love or with our friends, you know, so there's already this kind of process, I suppose. And yeah, so freedom can never be sort of infinite or unlimited in this way. You know, that's a kind of fantasy, but there has to be a notion of freedom that's completely operative, I think, for our politics.
Well, the next question goes back to the topic of art. Since you mentioned discomfort and distaste, I think we both have a shared appreciation of the work of Pasolini, his cinema and his thinking as well. In one of your articles in Art Review, you say that you reflect endlessly on the character of the Duke in Salo. The Duke is, of course, Il Duce's Mussolini, or the character that Pasolini has created, representing Mussolini in this satirical work. and he says, "We fascists are the only true anarchists naturally. Once we're masters of the state." So how prophetic was this statement? And does this prophecy the success of the present day neo-fascists, like I would think of Steve Bannon, for example, because present day neo-fascism, it promises a certain social chaos, a certain transgression, whereas the left, or what's self-denominated as the left today, is much more rules-based, trying to generate new rules. How do we recapture those who, especially among the working class, among those who are excluded in society, how do we recapture those people also who have been misled by the Duke today, figures like Bannon, who promised this, this chaos of Salot in the film, for example?
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, I think this sentence from the film is extremely ambiguous, and the reason why I think about it often, and Agamben talks about it too, is because of its ambiguity in certain respects. And to say that fascists are the only true anarchists in a way is to say that fascism is kind of headless, is without rules, without a kind of leader. Let's say paradoxically, that if you are the leader, there's no one above you, in a certain way. And I think both the left and the right historically have suffered from cult of personality issues as regards the structure of their politics. And I think this is a very, dubious aspect of politics. At the same time, when you look at completely kind of acephalic or headless organizations, there are kind of questions about how you get things done, and whether you need people to kind of play the role, let's say, of the organizer, or so I think there's something kind of perennial about these sorts of questions. I think something, one of the problems today, I think, is a misuse of term. I think fascism is overused by people on the left. I think it doesn't necessarily always apply correctly to the phenomena that people are describing. I think it's a word that obviously has an extraordinary power, an extraordinary emotional resonance.
Today,
yeah.
Sorry to.
No,
today, today I am calling you from Argentina, which is a country where, I'm a citizen. I am, in a way, Argentinian, and among other things. And this is a country that has a very long and intense history of fascism, many different forms of fascism. And this sentence of the Mussolini character, for somebody who's, I think it's interesting that you give a British interpretation of it, because I've seen you talk about Hobbes and the Leviathan, and this creature, if its head is removed, it still keeps crawling. But for somebody from a society that has very entrenched history of fascist regimes, to me, intuitively, I understand, at least I think I do, that Mussolini in the movie is saying it's the promise of chaos, the promise of corruption, of a big fun mess, whereas anarchists like to make a lot of rules. The leftist anarchists, of course, but you seem to give a British take on it, like Hobbes, who our viewers might not be entirely familiar with, but.
Sure, and I think typically we would associate order and rules with fascism, right? We would associate it with a kind of hierarchical, regulated society that mandates particular modes of behaviour and so on. So, to say that fascism is chaos is one way of thinking about it. It's not necessarily how we would necessarily think about fascism in Nazi Germany in particular, and the kind of the role of order and hierarchy there. I think one of the ways in which I understand Pasolini and the whole of Salò and some of his other works is, in a way, the malleability of the human in a certain way in the face of different ideologies. So when people today sort of act as if they could never be manipulated by particular ideologies. I think this is a mistake. I think people should be open to understanding that everybody is manipulable, and just because you say you're not, or you're a good person, or you're on the right side, this doesn't necessarily mean that you are and that you will be. And I think these are deep, pre-political anthropological questions about group belonging, about in groups, about politics as libido, and the way in which people can be swayed.
Do we return to this stage of the atavistic, this primal tribal type of condition, precisely because Thatcher's or the neoliberal system has just eliminated many institutions, has drained the educational system of intellectual content, has reduced the space where people can gather and encounter? Because I think it's important now that the right wing is very, very successful with many center-right publications making arguments that are soundly pointing out cancel culture, but devoid of any leftist analysis. Like, how is the economic system sending us back to this tribalism, which we also see on the left, we see it on the right, of course, the ethno-tribal culture in Europe, the right wing.
Yeah, and I think one thing that was quite interesting to note at a year ago, at the beginning of the lockdown, was the way in which individual nation, like the nation state, came back with a great force. Europe was not in operation. It was Italy, it was Spain, it was, and individual countries made their own decisions. And that was a very interesting moment, it seemed to me, post Brexit, in the kind of image of Europe, that actually we ended up back in national situations where countries were making decisions about their borders, that were very particular to that place. And that was quite surprising, I think, for a lot of people. I mean, I certainly found it quite surprising. And yeah, I mean, I think people do want to belong to things, and there is a sense in which people are quite tribal. And I mean, I'm not saying that people would always, that's the most important thing, right? People can also think internationally. They can think at the level of humanity. They can say, like, I'm a member of the human race. They can say, I'm a member of, I don't know, a group of people who like this particular thing, right? There are multiple different ways of belonging, obviously. And at the moment, we have a situation in which some forms of belonging are kind of acceptable and some forms are not, perhaps for good reason. And I don't know, the more you force people, I suppose, into isolated groups, and you say that you're not kind of welcome in polite society, or, the harder it is to get people out of those things, which is why I now increasingly end up sounding like a liberal, which is to say, we should talk to everybody. Everybody should, express their different opinions and views, and because in a way, it seems to me that this is the only thing we can do that actually increasing separation and segregation of people into groups is actually very, very detrimental for any collective project. And so on the one hand, you do, as you say, have the neoliberal smashing of solidarity, of all social movements, of all people into consumerist individuals. This has been going on for decades, right? As you mentioned, this is a very successful project. It's created a particular type of human being in certain ways. It's all publicness, all socialness, all of those collective dimensions have been completely smashed almost entirely. There are still unions, there are still people who, work together, so on, of course. But, this seems to be a very concerted project, right? At the same time, you have other forms of kind of ostracism and isolation. Oh, you voted for Brexit. You think this, you think that. We can't be friends. I can't talk to you. Multiple people have broken friendships. People who have stop talking to their families, over these political disagreements, which strikes me as very, very sad, So I don't know, there's so many different ways in which people are fragmented, both from the right and from the left, it seems to me, and how to bring people back together and at least to talk is a very difficult question, I think.
It seems that language and culture are in a crisis, because one would presume that dialogue makes some minimal difference, at least. speaking of which, here in Argentina, I went out of my house on the 8th of March to buy a sandwich, and I was stumbling upon enormous movements, demonstrations of young girls and older women as well, but mostly young women dressed up in green scarves, uttering a very primal scream to celebrate the 8th of March and playing drums. So that brings up the issue, of course, of feminism, since you entered the literary scene with The One-Dimensional Woman, a book referring to the title referring to Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man. But in recent lectures, you raised doubts as to whether there ever was a patriarchy, I suppose, in an anthropological sense. Of course, this also relates to the show's questions about the nation states. So you alluded in a prior lecture, and I found this very interesting, especially to hear this fresh perspective from someone on the left. In Men, Women, and the 20th Century, a lecture, you give this tentative and, in our current context, provocative suggestion that we are in a post-patriarchy, or maybe there never was a patriarchy, or do you mean that we have failed to acknowledge, at least in many contexts, intellectual contexts, that women have had different forms of power? Or what do you mean?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that there definitely have been kind of patriarchal relations, right? And it's so I'm not denying that there are kind of modes of property relation and possessiveness, and women being treated as a kind of property in lots of different social and political contexts. I think the point is partly more psychoanalytical. There's lots of interesting work on the kind of in Mitterschlick and others on the kind of death of the father, this idea that in a way the father figure has been, as particularly after he's writing after the rise of Hitler and these kind of Führer type figures. I mean, we still have kind of patriarchal male leaders in some countries, of course, but the idea that there's been, in a sense, a kind of collapse of this paternal function, such that men and women have increasingly become more like siblings, more like brothers and sisters, and that everybody's kind of more or less on the same sort of level, and therefore we're quite rivalrous and competitive and so on. And this rivalry is obviously encouraged in particular spheres such as the employment, where women's mass entry into the workforce basically generates much more competition, if you like. There are more employees, and employers can make more money rather than paying the man a family wage. And so every form of emancipation on capitalism's own terms is, of course, at the same time a kind of defeat, right, for a genuinely emancipatory way of being together. And I suppose, just like with One-Dimensional Woman, and this is from 2009, I was criticizing the kind of consumerist image of feminism. And I think today there's lots of like lip service paid towards like patriarchy, like as if the patriarchy is just this thing you can it's this monster and you can point to it. And, but there's a serious question about how this actually operates on a social level. Like, are men really, behaving in such a terrible way? Shouldn't we actually be getting on better and reconciling in certain ways, the better to kind of confront the reality of our economic and political situation? And I think there's been a lot of demonizing of men in recent years, which is kind of anti-political, that is very unhelpful, in fact, for thinking about how we actually do get on and how we can get on. So I'm still very much on this suspicion of the way in which these terms like feminism can be put to ideological ends, that, and of course there are lots of different aspects of feminism, and I align myself with the second wave primarily. I think the second wave feminists of the late 60s and early 70s where the most serious questions were being asked about what women's role is, what women's history is, what women's relation to men is, and all of and so on. And I think that's an incomplete project. And I think what we've seen afterwards are kind of fake feminisms, really, that have followed the second wave project, because some of the questions there are very difficult, and it would involve this kind of mass collective psychoanalytic moment and this discussion between men and women.
So your interpretation then of the term patriarchy would be more psychoanalytic, that even if Christine Lagarde runs the European Central Bank, somewhere in her brain there's this psychoanalytic force of the father figure, rather than what we see more on the left, of course, is a conspiratorial version that the whole economic system can be called patriarchy, but then even if they explain it well, it sounds like a metaphor at best.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to say that it's by saying psychoanalytic, I don't mean it's purely kind of personal or psychological in that way. I suppose, yeah, what the psychoanalytic dimension is more the kind of almost like the collective discussion that we need to have, the serious ones, right? And that would be a kind of almost like a group therapy in the Langian sense, but for everybody. And yeah, but I suppose, yeah, it's obvious that having a few female CEOs doesn't change the structure of capitalism, right? Like that idea of female representation in high places does nothing to challenge the thing. At the same time, we might want to say, well, what is so good about being really having loads of power in this terrible system? Who wants to be like the boss of a massive corporation? It would be a nightmare. Like, this isn't freedom either, right? So there's no freedom to be found in this very limited notion of feminism, in which I think, where you just have a few women at the top. Like, it clearly isn't. It's not the social individual that we might be interested in, I think.
Well, it is very interesting, and of course, the feminism that is mass marketed today is also a rejection of solitude, a rejection of risk-taking behavior, which is seen as toxic masculinity, of course. So I understand that you believe in going back to the achievements of the second wave and making sure to secure them, rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Well, it's a funny metaphor, and in relation to feminism, of course. But what about the possibility that the current situation or the current dysfunction somehow emerged from some kind of ideological mistakes or shortcomings in certain parts of the second wave? For example, I was reading an old essay by, well, I don't want to drop too many names, but like Catherine McKinnon, for example, she seemed, together with Andrea Dworkin, these academic, legal, activist feminists in the United States, seem to have more or less, well, very much furthered the idea of deplatforming, or the idea that deplatforming can be justified according to what is being deplatformed. And
you mean in relation to the pornography and censorship discussion?
Pornography, but also provocative art. For example, if I think of a figure like Mia Merrill, she is a corporate consultant who circulated this petition to remove a Baltus painting from the Metropolitan Museum. And there are, of course, many other instances of that kind of cancellation culture against art, against female nudes. I do tend to think of how the second wave very much objected to men drawing female nudes. And
I think, the second wave includes radical feminists, it includes Marxist feminists, it includes materialist feminists, it includes liberal feminists, so, I mean, you're referring to a very specific aspect of radical feminism, and a particular kind of a legal attempt to kind of censor pornography for its harmful and damaging effects. But, yes, you're right, it crosses over into art. I mean, obviously I'm against that kind of censorship. At the same time, I do think we should have a conversation about the damages that pornography does, for example. I write about this in my new book. So these things are not kind of value neutral in that sense. And I suppose what I mean about the second wave is, as I said before, it's like where these questions are posed in the most serious possible way. right? So instead of thinking that we've answered them, or instead of thinking that the second wave is, historical, irrelevant, that actually we need to go back to these questions, even if we take a different line, even if we say, no, we're so anti-censorship that we must allow all forms of pornography or whatever, it would still be the same deep problem or deep question.
But critics of the second wave, for example, Andrea Dworkin, of course, she's not a Marxist or a materialist, I would say. She, for example, compared Hemingway to Hitler. And there I do see a precursor to closing down writers, to depublishing or unpublishing books in the recent years. So, but
yeah, I don't know. I mean, when Dworkin is a literary critic, I mean, she's an amazing literary critic, and she reads these male novelists in particular ways. It's true, and in very particular kind of ways. And I don't think we can censor the past, right? I don't think anyone would gain by having like the works of, I don't know, D.H. Lawrence or Hemingway or, I don't know, Bukowski or whoever we want to say is a toxic male writer. Like, for one thing, there are too many of these books in the world. Like, you won't be able to do it, right? You can start removing things from the internet, but people have hard copies of things, right? And in any case, I don't think Dworkin when she's writing literary criticism is saying we shouldn't read these people. I mean, she herself is reading them and, and criticizing them in a very particular way. Absolutely. So I think there's a kind of difference there between a sort of very, severe critique and an attempt to sort of, I don't know, identify almost in a paranoid way or conspiratorial way, or, what writers are really doing, with a kind of, I don't know, what we see now. And it's partly a function of the technology. It's like, so Dworkin writes a book and she says these critical things, right? How many people are going to read this book? Whereas online, you kind of whip up, like, for a day, mass mobs and institutions will panic and drop people because they think that there's a publicity crisis, right? But it's on a different scale. It's a different kind of technology because of the way platforms work. And
now the hate mail that people send privately is just public on Twitter, and that creates chaos. And institutions just lack the backbone to hold their ground.
I think there's a crisis of values in institutions, right? If institutions were committed to disagreement, debate, difficult ideas, and so on, but they're ultimately not. They're basically committed to making money and not having bad publicity, right? So in a way, it doesn't even matter what the disagreement is, or someone doesn't like a piece of work, or they don't want someone to speak. That's not necessarily what the institution is worried about. They're worried about their own reputation. They're worried about their finances. So, and I think this is a kind of big civilizational, cultural problem. You need institutions that have values that transcend capitalist morals.
Just to pick up on a couple of things, because it's quite interesting. When you talk about feminism, in your writings, do you focus on Western European and US kind of experiences, or do you also take into consideration other places, for example, the Middle East, or let's say East Asia or South America? That's one part of the question. Also, the second thing is how social media is also, or these new platforms are kind of, as you said, confusing things or making things kind of like give it a megaphone, and then it gets kind of has its own inertia. That's one, but also how is freedom of movement is important. For example, you have all these wars, you have all these kind of borders, and then this is also related to the freedom of thought. When you have people moving, you have different thoughts coming together, or just kind of create a new thing. So how are all these things coming together in 21st century, I'd say?
Yeah, I mean, complicated set of questions. I mean, I say my focus is primarily on Western feminism. I think there's something kind of sometimes really inappropriate where people from a particular background or with a particular racial identity try to speak about things that they don't know about, or try to speak on behalf of others. Like, Deleuze talks about this, the indignity of speaking on behalf of others. I think there's a problem with doing that. Like, I'd rather listen to feminists in the Middle East or from Africa telling me what they're working on or what they're doing or what they're thinking. So I don't know. I mean, it's complicated because obviously there's one way of looking at which say, oh, you're parochial, you're Eurocentric, but another would be to say, well, why should I talk about something I don't know about? I want to listen to other people. And I think there's a lot of confusion about these positions at the moment, that you can slam somebody for not talking about X and Y, but you can do that to anybody. You can say, well, you haven't talked about this or this or that. It's like, no, well, I'm talking about this, and yeah.
But you do hope to resonate with an audience beyond Europe, or in South America and Middle East.
Yeah, of course. But at the same time, I wouldn't want anyone to listen to me if they didn't think it was relevant. I think it's, everybody comes from their own particular position, and all we can do in our lives is to listen to other people. And the second point that Mohammed makes about freedom of movement and encounter, is, again, the lockdown has basically raised this question of borders in a very different way. We've had basically border closures, and lots of people formerly in favor of freedom of movement are now in favor of closed borders because there's a health crisis. So, you have this oscillation, I think, on this question. And obviously freedom of movement has long been a kind of neoliberal principle as well. So there's the kind of capitalist freedom of movement, and then there's the kind of a communist freedom of movement, or like, what would it mean for people to be free and move freely and to encounter one another in a free way? And it's so we have to be very careful how different we're talking, what kind of freedom movement we mean. And the lockdown is extreme in this way, like for keeping people in place. And obviously, you had fires in the asylum centers on Greek islands, and it's increased the problem of where people are in very, very difficult almost prison-like situations, basically.
Yeah, there's also a resort to scientific authority by people who are clearly scientific illiterates, but pundits in this or that magazine who are invoking science as if science is dominated by consensus. And I noticed that the scandals around the reaction to an Oxford epidemiologist, Sunetra Gupta, who was slandered. She herself is an anti-neoliberal in her political views. She's very left-wing, but she was slandered, accused of having taken money from the Koch brothers or something, because she advocated a different lockdown model, which was not the one of the right, some extremists like Trump, of course, but also not the authoritarian model of Macron and so forth. Mm-hmm. So we often think of the freedom of movement and the freedom of speech. Immigration, freedom of speech today are somehow artificially dissociated from each other along very partisan lines. So when it comes to freedom of migration, you'll often hear people on the left, people speaking of open borders, without pausing to say, wait a minute, does that mean also open to goods, duty-free? And on the right, there is somehow a claim to the discourse of freedom of speech, which also is often about the freedom to express anti-immigration positions. So how do we relate the freedom to wander? This is something I think about as well. The freedom to walk around, the freedom to move, to roam, to the freedom of thought, the freedom to think, the freedom to express oneself, freedom of speech. Are these artificially separated? And I want to ask a philosopher, how can we deconstruct that artificial, partisan separation? I hope this is not a too complicated soup of a question for you.
No, I appreciate this question. I agree, because sometimes the freedom of speech, for example, is treated in isolation from freedom of association, freedom of protest, freedom of movement. And it really shouldn't be, because then it gets kind of, it seems too lightweight on its own, like it's just a kind of right-wing talking point or something like this. But if you think about it from the other side, like the reason why we put people in prison, right, is obviously to inhibit their movement apart from anything else. or whatever we think we're doing when we punish people, there's also a sense in which people are let's say they're geographically trapped, they're stuck, and so we can still think when we're in prison, right? But at the same time, it's a lockdown of that too. You're not allowed to talk to your friends, you're not allowed to see people, so on and so on. And so we can see from the extreme forms of imprisonment that we do have a negative image of freedom. So freedom is not that, right? Freedom is not being isolated and being stuck in a small place. So we can conclude that freedom is nomadism and free association and freedom to talk and freedom to express and freedom to protest and all of those things. So there is a way in which, how to put this, like, they must be understood together, if that was the kind of point of your question, not artificially separated. And I mean, one way of kind of, let's say, having positive freedom of movement would be for Western countries to not bomb other countries so that they become unlivable and uninhabitable. And I mean, this is clearly the case. I mean, people don't necessarily want to flee their homes and be forced to seek asylum in other places. When people have livable situations, they don't tend to do this. So, the question of war and freedom is, like, obviously crucial here. How do we ensure peace as well?
War and also the financial crises caused by the liberal flow of capital, the IMF, which makes life unlivable, which destroys opportunities, that as well. Well, this is a very interesting talk. Mohammed had to leave, not in protest. So now we can get into something that I've been curious to ask you about, since more than a few times I've heard you mention the hot topic, or not so fashionable topic, that it should be, of an interest in human sacrifice. and you mentioned Girard,
yeah.
I'm in Latin America, so I think of the Aztec and many other indigenous cultures who, they, in a way, for them, human sacrifice, at least according to all the studies and literature on it, is a form of affirming life by affirming death, a kind of embrace of mortality. And so, but I don't know if that is your angle, or if you are looking more at pagan rituals in Merry England, and do you see human sacrifice something good, bad, as a metaphor for things the way people are behaving today? Are they?
Yeah, I mean, let me be clear. I mean, I think it's of anthropological and historical interest that human beings have, in various cultures and times, performed human sacrifice, or people have sacrificed themselves. There are various ritual modes of doing this. And if you read Bataille, he's very interested in sacrifice, and as you mentioned, René Girard. I suppose, let's to be clear, I'm not in favor of human sacrifice. I'm interested in thinking about the ways in which technology, in relation to what Girard says about the scapegoat, might provide mechanisms for virtual sacrifice. I think the scapegoat mechanism, it's a deep anthropological need, right? It's something that human beings always do in one way or another. They are interested in the in-group and the out-group, and one way of shoring up the strength of the in-group is to sacrifice a member of the in-group and ostracize them or punish them, And Girard obviously talks about this in relation to Christianity and the kind of preemptive sacrifice of Christ as the kind of social bond that permits a form of functional religiosity, such that someone has already died, they've already sacrificed themselves for your sins, such that even when you sin, it's already kind of understood. And this is a very, very effective mechanism. It's why Christianity is very clever in certain ways. And I think as we move to a kind of, let's say, largely secularized online world, you still have the same anthropological desires to punish individuals, to kind of scapegoat. but you don't have the same mechanisms of forgiveness and atonement that Christianity offer, or confession for that matter, and that's a psychoanalytic thing as well. So I'm interested in it as a metaphor in relation to, how people perform virtual sacrifice, because I think online permits the idea that you're not really damaging someone because you're not really hurting the body, that you might be using their name, but you're not really hurting. It's not really real, that the internet provides this kind of virtual and therefore sort of not real fantasy space. And, so this is, yeah.
Sorry for that.
That's my interest.
Yeah. So, I think of early Christianity, the different churches were in fierce competition with each other to who could rack up the most martyrs, who could.
Yeah.
And of course, in the current landscape, one also thinks of the anti-Semitic blood libel, the way Jewish people since the Middle Ages were accused of sacrificing a Christian child in the synagogue. It was a very violent slander, defamation that promoted pogroms, promoted mobbing. So Mohammed has left and apologizes for his poor connectivity. I almost said collectivity.
No, it was fine. I could understand everything. Was good.
Oh, that's great to hear. So we know that you have one book in the works, What Do Men Want? And there's another more recent book, more artistic, less anthropological, called Platforms. It reads partly as an ode to your friends Mark Fisher, the great cultural theorist, author of Capitalist Realism. And I'm sorry I haven't read it. I can't afford it because it's like £200, but it's a real collector's item. But it takes.
I can send you one. It's really
wonderful.
Not.
Oh, wonderful. I'll send you some of my books, but I don't know if you're into poetry. Although this book, excellent. This book takes on the form of a poem or a literary artwork. So how did Platforms emerge into being, and do you have like a relation to literature, like as in literary, as in non-academic, from the reviews? And this is a hazardous guess because I haven't read your book, but I think of like Jean Rhys's book Voyage in the Dark, a little novel of Jean Rhys. But anyway, we would also like it if you could share with us and the audiences some recollection of Mark Fisher, who left us too soon.
Sure. I mean, the book really kind of only in a way draws on some memories of Mark and some ideas of his around acid communism, which was his kind of unfinished project. And yeah, I mean, it's I don't know, it's difficult to talk about Mark. I mean, everybody who knew him for a period of time has their own kind of, memories and thoughts and, complicated and difficult feelings, I think, and they don't really go away. And yeah, I suppose, I don't know, just I've been writing a lot of political commentary and non-fiction, and I suppose I just wanted to do something that was more personal, and it's a kind of work of autofiction. It's not really a poem, it's kind of like prose that's a bit poetic, I suppose, and it has some kind of philosophical ideas in there. And I suppose it was just another modality. Like, I'd been teaching for a long time and I left my jobs teaching philosophy at Roehampton, and so I just wanted to do something that was maybe more personal. And I think the confessional mode is often really tied to women in a certain way, and female writers. And I think there are some maybe complicated reasons why it's like this. So.
Well, like St. Augustine's Confessions, yes.
Yes, well, okay. No. Some of them are written by men. Rousseau too, he had a go. But yeah, I mean, philosophers, they occasionally write confessions as well. And it's not exactly a confession. It's sort of confessional in a certain way, but it's not a confession.
Well, perhaps on this confessional or not so confessional notes, we could close, as we are at an hour and 15. So many thanks, Nina, for having joined us, the Cosmopolitan Shipwrecks.
No, thank you.
Thank you, and we look forward to future correspondence with you and to read more, to hear more from you.
Absolutely.